Greetings and welcome back to MyfanwyNia studio here in Leitrim's Iron Mountains. My name is Harriet and today I will be sharing another short watercolor time-lapse in my sketchbook. Today is day 5 of Mermay and doing daily mermaids for the month of May, and the prompt list that I am following is by Erica Joy here on YouTube, and I will leave a link below to her channel, so you should go along and also check out all of Erica's wonderful mermaid paintings. And I will also leave a link to her prompt list if you would like to join in for the month of May. So this piece was day 5 and the prompt was tiger shark. Just off the top of my head, I wasn't exactly sure what type of shark a tiger shark was. So just a quick search, I found that the tiger shark is named for its gills. It has 3 striped gills on the side of its head, and I suppose they look a little bit like tiger stripes, but it is just a kind of bluey grey shark, and it has sharp teeth. So I decided to style my mermaid with shark sensibilities. So I gave her big teeth and a wide grin. I decided to start this painting differently from my previous day's paintings and challenge myself not to use any pens, because I do believe that I rely too much on pens sometimes because they give such good outlines. I think that my hand is steady enough that I can get all the outlines and just use a fine brush. It just takes a little bit of patience. Actually, this painting was much faster for me. I've completed this in about half the time of my previous paintings. It is more motif-like, and I didn't do as much of a background on this particular one, but I think that it has a vibrancy, a quality that I really like. I think because it was so different from kind of my go-to style for my characters, I think that I enjoyed it in a different way, and it taught me something about maybe pushing myself a little bit beyond the boundaries of my usual approach. So I did start off with a mechanical pencil, and I made sure that I was happy with the sketch. I did tidy up the sketch with the eraser quite a bit before I introduced the paint. Once I introduced the paint, I washed out the areas of the painting quite fast, and I think it was quite fast because I knew I wanted to keep the colours minimal, and predominantly Prussian blue was my colour of choice. I wanted her skin as well to be a little bit on the green side. So I just washed in a very simple wash and just gave it an all-over indication of what I wanted the painting to take shape as. When this was dry, I erased as much of the lead lines that I could, anything that wasn't covered with paint, because I didn't want to rub away too hard at the painting because I didn't want it to lift the pigment of the paint off the surface of the paper. But I tidied up any loose pencil marks. The visible pencil marks that I could see through the watercolor, those were my guides for that line work. I was just very methodical, redefining those lines with the watercolor paint and a fine brush. I was able to pull a little bit of that saturated line into that shading that I'd already put down, and it just gave the painting a different kind of workability for me. Part of this challenge is every day building on what you're learning from the day before. It does help as well doing these videos because I'm able to see the progression of some of these pieces, and I'd often be watching the video and I'm like, oh goodness, the painting actually looked better in an earlier instance and I definitely overworked it. So seeing that and then approaching a new piece, you can make a more informed decision that actually maybe I won't add that extra bit of paint, or maybe I won't add another layer of color there. The outline is fine. This actually had ended up taking me half the time than the previous works I had been doing. I think I was averaging around 4 hours for a painting, and this one just took me just over 2 hours to complete. And saying that, I know it is quite motif-like and doesn't have too much for background, but I don't think that was the main factor. I think that I was just more in the zone with this one, and I think this is my favorite piece so far. Sometimes less is definitely more. Following on from my last video, when I included a narration of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid as the original text, I just love this piece of writing. It really takes me into that underwater world. I think it's only right that I should perhaps finish reading the story and not leave anyone who is interested in it hanging. If you were listening yesterday, just a little recap. We're introduced to the mermaid in her underwater world with her 6 sisters, her grandmother, and the Sea King. And the grandmother has informed the little mermaid that she will be able to go up to the surface on her 15th birthday. All her sisters are older than her, and the eldest has just turned 15, and she's to go up first. So I will continue from here. The Little Mermaid, Part 2. The oldest princess was 15 years old and was to venture above the surface of the sea. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell, but most delightful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on the sandbank in the calm water and see to the coast the great city where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to hear music and the noise of the clamour of carriages and humans, to see the many church towers and spires and hear the bells ringing out. Precisely because she could not come up there, she longed most of all for this. Oh, how the youngest sister was all ears, and later that evening she stood by the open window and gazed through the dark blue waters. She thought of the great city with all its noise and clamour. She believed that she could hear the church bells sounding down where she was. The following year, the second sister was allowed to rise through the water and swim wherever she wanted. She swam up just as the sun was setting, and it was a sight for which she felt was the most loveliest. The whole sky had looked as if it was of gold, she said, and the clouds, well, their loveliness she could not describe enough. Red and yellow, they had sails all over her head, but far swifter than them, like a long white veil. A flock of wild swans had flown over the water where the sun stood. She swam towards it, but it sank, and the rosy gleam on the surface of the sea and the clouds was extinguished. The following year, the third sister came up there. She was the boldest of them all, so she swam to a broad estuary that flowed into the sea. She saw lovely green slopes with vines. Castles and manors peeped out from magnificent forests. She heard how the birds sang and the sun shone so strongly that she often had to dive under the surface to cool her burning face. In a small bay, she met a whole flock of small human children, completely naked. They ran about splashing in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away in fear, and a small black animal appeared. It was a dog. She had never seen a dog before. It barked so terribly at her. She was scared and made for the open sea, but she could never forget the magnificent forests, the green hillsides, and the charming children who could swim on the water, even though they didn't have any tail. The fourth sister was not as bold. She stayed out in the wild mid-ocean and said that it was precisely this that was the loveliest. One could see for many miles around on all sides, and the sky above, like a great bell jar. She had seen ships far off, but they looked like gulls. The amusing dolphins had turned somersaults, and the huge whales had spouted water up out of their blowholes, so it had looked like hundreds of fountains around her. It was now the fifth sister, her turn. Her birthday happened to be in the winter, so what she had seen, the others had not seen on their first visit. The water looked quite green, and great icebergs were swimming around in it. Each of them looked like a pearl, she said, and yet they were far bigger than the church towers humans built. They appeared in the most remarkable shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had sat down on one of the largest, and all the sailing ships in fright had given her a wide berth where she sat, letting the wind play in her long hair. But later that evening, the sky became overcast, and there was thunder and lightning, while the black sea lifted the great blocks of ice high up and let them gleam in the red lightning. The sails were taken in on all ships, and they were in fear and dread, but she calmly sat on her swimming iceberg and watched the blue stroke of lightning zigzag down into the gleaming sea. The first time any of the sisters came above the surface of the water, each of them was always fascinated by the new beautiful things she saw. But since they now, as grown-up girls, were allowed to go up whenever they wanted, things lost their appeal. They longed to be back home, and after a month they said that it was most beautiful of all down here where they lived, and so nice to be home. On many an evening, the 5 sisters interlocked arms and rose in a row above the water. They had beautiful voices, more beautiful than any humans, and when a storm blew up, so they thought the ships were bound to go under, they would swim in front of the ships and sing so beautifully of how delightful it was on the seabed, and tell the sailors not to be frightened. But the sailors were unable to understand the words, and thought it was just the storm, nor did they get to see any of these delights. For when their ships sank, those on board drowned and only came down to the Sea King's palace as corpses. When the sisters gathered in the evening, arm in arm, they ascended through the sea, their little sister thus left behind all on her own, and it was as if she would cry. But a mermaid has no tears, and so she had to suffer all the more. "Ah, if only I was 15 years old," she said. "I know I would grow really fond of the world above us, and of the people who build and live up there." And so at last she reached the age of 15.
"There, now we've got you off our hands,"
her grandmother, the old Queen Mother, said.
"Come here, let me deck you out like your sisters."
And she placed a garland of white lilies in her hair, but each petal in the flower was half a pearl, and the old lady had 8 large oysters attach themselves to the princess's tail to indicate her high rank. "It hurts so much," the little mermaid said.
"Yes, one has to go through a great deal of trouble to look nice,"
the old woman said. Oh, how she would have liked to shake all of this finery off and laid the heavy garland aside. Her red flowers in the garden suited her much better, but she didn't dare rearrange things. "Goodbye," she said, and rose so light and clear, like a bubble through the water. The sun had just set as she lifted her head above the surface of the water, but all the clouds were still gleaming like roses and gold. In the midst of the pale red sky, the evening stars shone so bright, with such brightness and beauty, and the air was mild and fresh. The sea was completely still. On it was a large ship with 3 masts, with only a single sail up, for there was not a breath of wind. And here, there, in the ropes, on the beams, the sailors were sitting. There was music and singing. As the evening grew darker, hundreds of many-coloured lamps were lit, so it looked as if the flags of every nation were waving in the wind. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and each time the sea swell lifted her up so she could see through the mirror-clear windows, where many of the people stood in fine array, but the most handsome was the young prince with the large black eyes. He couldn't have been much older than 16, and it was his birthday, which is why there was so much of a to-do. The sailors were dancing on deck, and the young prince came out. More than 100 rockets shot up into the sky. They lit everything up as if it was broad daylight, so the little mermaid was very frightened and dived under the surface. She soon stuck her head up again, and then it was as if stars in the sky had fallen down to her. She had never seen such pyrotechnics before. Great suns span round, wonderful fire fishes soared into the blue sky, and everything was reflected by the clear, calm sea. On board the ship, everything was so bright that one could see every little rope and the people too. And oh, how handsome the young prince was. And he clasped people's hands, laughed and smiled, while the music rang out into the wonderful evening. That was part 2 of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. It's quite an epic saga, so you'll have to wait until another video to hear what happens to her. Not to spoil it, it doesn't have the same ending as the version most people are familiar with. We're coming to the end of my time-lapse now, so if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you're taking part in Mermay, please let me know where I can see all of your wonderful mermaid artwork. Do stay safe, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Bye-bye.